Hello, welcome back to Before the Weekend, my weekly update on things that I consider as relevant, things that matter to me. As topics I have the flop of Deliveroo, the example of Volvo cars, are unions still relevant, and some philosophical reflections around Easter. I hope you'll enjoy it. Welcome. With the loss of 30% of value right after the IPO of Deliveroo, we can easily say that this has not been a success. And that despite the impressive growth of sales in 2020, obviously very much driven by the pandemic. What can we learn from this? What insights do we get from this very attractive enterprise with a new concept and still not really very successful in its investing attraction? First of all, we can learn that investors will use their influence more and more to push enterprises in a certain direction. It can be the good direction, it can also be the wrong direction if that is driven mainly by greed, by short-term financial interest. Very much what has been happening in the Lannoo saga, the French food group. Second, we can also see that more and more investors will expect from enterprises they will invest in a certain standard of ethics, a certain standard of responsibility, sometimes even very high standards of responsibility. And those enterprises that do not necessarily have a clear strategy, or that potentially, like is the case with Deliveroo, is not necessarily respecting labor laws or holiday arrangements, or that is actually considering their employees more as fake independents, with the disadvantages of being an independent and not the advantages of being an employee, might put at risk the future growth and the future reputation of the enterprise, and that is obviously pushing back certain investors who don't want to go there. I also believe that more and more investors are looking to enterprises that will stand for clear noble purposes and for clear ecological, human, ethical, diversity-driven policies and strategies. And I find it, to conclude this part, I find it really interesting to see how we have a major shift going on. Before, enterprises were the ones who had to convince, when enterprises were very consciously entrepreneuring, when they had the ideas of conscious capitalism, where they wanted to stand for a noble purpose, where they wanted to drive their strategy and drive their organization with a specific approach of sustainability. Often they had to convince the financial markets and the investors that that was going to bring long-term gain. Now we see that more and more investors, also enterprises like BlackRock have been exemplary in that, are pushing the enterprises in which they will invest to have these specific ethical long-term or longer-term standards. And I think that what is happening is that we're going to come to a symbiosis where both the enterprise, the entrepreneurs, and the investors will work together for that long-term perspective. So where we come from is a short-term greed perspective, and we are evolving to a long-term sustainable ethical perspective. And I think that is really welcoming. Volvo Cars has announced this week that each employee who gets a child or who adopts a child will get 24 weeks of parental leave. When enterprise is setting the example for the entire industry and maybe even for the global economy. What can we learn from this? We can learn from this that capitalism and humanism, the care for people and the interest in capital, they can go together. We also learn that doing this is really pushing forward the gender balance, the equal rights between male and female in still a very traditional male industry. We also learn that it is really pushing forward the balance between the part of our work and the part of our non-work in our life, to find a better balance. And for Volvo, which is considering itself as a very human and people-oriented enterprise, this seems to be really important. And now I'm really interested to understand how this is going to be picked up by other enterprises, how actually governments will also integrate that, because it's a decision from the enterprise as an offer to their people. They also see it as a way to attract people, and I think it's a really smart way, because enterprises will really have to find ways themselves, what maybe governments cannot do, find ways themselves to attract and retain people. And here is an interesting logic. What we have been observing in many enterprises that really care for their people is that people become more loyal, they will be more engaged, they will give more and better energy, better performance, and by that also the organizational performance will increase, and by that also the financial performance of organizations will increase. So the bottom line is really, well, you invest in the people, you actually invest also in your enterprise. And it's, as a conclusion, the way how capital and human care really come together in this approach of giving 24 weeks to all parents at Volvo Cars. Great example. We had a national strike last Monday in Belgium, and that in full COVID pandemic, in the semi-lockdown, with the economic system under pressure and many enterprises going through difficult times. Belgium is a country that is known for its high standard of living, but also for its surrealism. And it was actually this surrealism that made me reflect about the role of unions for the coming decades. And I'm looking now at unions from a global perspective. I think we have to make a separation between underdeveloped economies and developed economies. In underdeveloped economies, I think unions really have an important role to play. They have to protect people, they have to give rights to people that wouldn't have them individually, and they are also there to guide enterprises and the economic system into a more developed direction, like very much it has been happening in many Western European and developed countries. And still, in certain very capitalism-driven countries, like we have the US, you have examples from the very beginning of the economic system with Henry Ford in the car industry, being very people-oriented while being an industrialist, a capitalist. Now, in the developed economies, I believe that unions have a very different role to play. Not being the oppositional force to the entrepreneurs and to enterprises, but I think unions should evolve to become partners in the development together with all the other stakeholders, like the shareholders, like the employees, like the clients and the suppliers, all together, to realize the noble purpose of an organization. And instead of being a counterforce to the progress of an organization by simply focusing on the individual rights of the workers, I think in these developed economies, the unions should work together and take on a different role. And I do believe that if unions are not going to do that, they will be starting to be more counterproductive than being productive and being useful and being meaningful. So I think it's interesting times for unions to rethink their role and their place in the economic system and in society. I want to end my Before the Weekend with some Easter philosophical reflection. Easter is traditionally the most important festival of Christianism. It celebrates the fact that Christ rose from the dead and that mankind was thereby redeemed. That was no longer an endpoint. Life was not meaningless. But this was preceded by a history of suffering, the crucifixion of Christ. So we as modern people, we have forgotten to suffer. Not that I want to suffer, not that I would invite you to suffer. And yet there is something about suffering, especially in these times. Easter is also the festival that reminds us that life is also suffering and not just pleasure, if life is to have meaning. So we must, I believe, develop a rapport with the less pleasant sides of life. Easter is about coming to terms with death, and the COVID pandemic seems to be a very confrontational example of that. That is not a fate that happens to you that denies our existence, but it is part of our life. And I see it really as finding happiness in the here and the now, in the moment, especially now with the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns that come with it and all the restrictions that are being posed upon us and all the things that we are used to do, that we like to do, that we love to do, that we cannot do, at least temporarily. So I would like to invite you for this Easter time as a time for contemplation and also reflection about the beauty and uniqueness of life, the beauty and the uniqueness of your life. I hope you have appreciated and found interest in these topics. I hope to see you again next week for my new Before the Weekend. Enjoy for those who have that as their tradition, the Easter weekend, and for those who do not have it as their tradition, simply enjoy the weekend. Bye-bye.